entitled Old Crisps.
Is it someone's front room?
Yeah.
Oh, right. That's nice.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Royal Photographic Society. We just have a few latecomers coming, but it's my great pleasure to introduce Gilly Read, who will be chairing this evening, and of course our special guest this evening, who is Colin Ford. So Gilly, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you. If you could just unmute yourself.
Yes, I have. Right. Hello, everybody. Tonight I have great pleasure in introducing Colin Ford as guest of the historical group of the Royal Photographic Society. Colin has a long and varied career associated with the history of photography. However, he did not start his career in photography. He has been a museum director of the Mander and Mitchison Theatre Collection, and a member of the Visual Arts Panel of the Arts Council of Great Britain. Until 2010, he was chairman of Krasner Crafts. Before he became deputy curator of the National Film Archive, he had been a theatre manager and a producer and taught at the California State University. Colin joined the National Portrait Gallery in 1972 as its first ever keeper of film and photography, the first senior curator of photography in any British National Museum or gallery. I first met Colin at an RPS historical group event on January the 21st, 1979, at the Portrait Gallery. This was after he had persuaded the Royal Academy not to sell the Hill and Adamson albums to America. This photograph shows the first assembly of the Free Church of Scotland. The photographic studies for this were the catalyst for the Hill and Adamson collaboration. And these are some of the Fisher people of New Haven. It was exciting to see these incredibly wonderful early photographs in their original albums. There really is nothing quite like seeing the original photographs. Then, in 1975, the Portrait Gallery purchased the Herschel album of Julia Margaret Cameron photographs. This is Annie, my first success, 1864. And Beatrice Cenci, another of her photographs. Julia Margaret Cameron photographs. Colin was the first person to do a catalogue raisonné of a photographer, and that was of Julia Margaret Cameron, Getty Publications, 2003. And here is Colin again outside the National Museum of Film, Photography and Television, where he was the keeper between 1982 and 1993. It was later the National Media Museum, and now it is the Media and Science Museum. There were many superb exhibitions there, and later the RPS collection of photographs was housed at the museum. In his interview for this post, Colin suggested that the RPS collection would make a perfect basis for a National Museum collection. Colin has continued his interest in the history of photography, and the Royal Photographic Society now gives a Colin Ford medal linked to a biennial series of Colin Ford lectures. It is given to people who are eminent in the field of photo history. Colin has written many books, including An Early Victorian Album, the masterpieces of David Octavius Hill and Robert Adamson, 1974, the Cameron Collection, an album of photographs by Julia Margaret Cameron. Whoops. The Cameron Collection, an album of photographs by Julia Margaret Cameron, and other books on Julia Margaret Cameron. Colin also has a long interest in Hungarian photography, as illustrated by this book, which he co-authored with Peter Bakai and George Zetis. The book is a companion to the exhibition which Colin curated at the Royal Academy, only the second photography exhibition ever to be held there. The photographs include a Broshoi, Kappa, Kurtesh, Molinoj and Munkashi. And I know Colin will correct my pronunciation of these names. So here are a few of these photographs that we saw at the exhibition. Broshoi, and this is Kappa, Trotsky, more Kappa, Kurtesh, Satiric Dancer, Molinoj, and Munkashi. And that is the end of my presentation. So Colin, would you please tell us all about your career? And thank you very much.
Colin, if I could just ask you to unmute and start your video and share your screen, please.
Ask it to unmute. There it is. Now I have to share screen.
If you could, please, that'd be great.
And find. No, that didn't work. How is that?
We're just seeing your email at the moment, Colin. If you could go to the PowerPoint that you've got.
I've only got the PowerPoint on the screen. Oh dear. Here we go again. Now what can you see?
Again, we're just seeing your email.
We've only practiced this about 10 times.
So just for the benefit of the audience, we have done a few run-throughs, and Colin was very proficient with his PowerPoint and sharing the screen. I think we've just, if you maybe close that window, you may have your PowerPoint open, Colin.
How about that?
If you could go and if you could come into Zoom and share your screen, that would be wonderful.
Go back to the Zoom. Go back. Zoom.
Well,
You're on Zoom now.
right.
Now you've got to. Have you gone to share screen?
More than once.
So I know we've all been using Zoom over the last 8 months or so, but it can still have its challenges for people.
I'm very sorry, everybody.
No, don't worry, Colin, don't worry. So if you come into Zoom and then try sharing your screen again, you should hopefully get to your PowerPoint. Perfect.
Yes. Perfect.
That's great, Colin. That's wonderful. I'll let you speak now.
Oh,
Good.
right. Sorry about that. Despite all my years in the business, obviously my technology is simply not up to it. And of course, I'm going to have to see if I can change the slides at the right moment too. But why does it say start my video? I'm already on it, aren't I?
If you could just start your video, Colin, then we'll see your face as well as your slide.
You don't see my face, do you?
Oh, we do, we do.
Nope. Yes.
Now, is everything correct now?
Yes.
A miracle. All right, well, if I go on playing with this long enough, I won't have to do any talking, will I?
If you could just go to play, Colin, if you could just go to play at the top, then we'll see your slides full screen. Wonderful. We've got you, we've got your slides. You're all good to go, Colin. Thank you.
Right. All I have to do is, right. Okay, now, Gilly mentioned that I actually, before I went to the National Portrait Gallery, and was, I think, the first curator of photography in any of the national museums or galleries, I did work for the British Film Institute National Film Archive, and here is a quick shot from the vaults in Berkhamsted, which I was the sort of business manager, not business manager, construction manager, and it was a very exciting and important part of my life. But it actually is the way I got into photography in the first place, because what happened is that the director of the National Portrait Gallery, who was David Piper, left, and Dr. Roy Strong, he wasn't Sir then, took over the post. Now, as it happens, David Piper had been a member of the Friends of the National Film Archive, and I was the secretary. That was one of my exciting opportunities, exciting parts of my job. And I just decided to go and see Roy Strong and ask him to take over David Piper's post. And it was something like 7 minutes walk to get to the National Portrait Gallery. And as I walked down there, I thought, I can't go to this man, you know, a director of a national museum at the time, seemed a bit like a god. I said, I can't just go and say, please, sir, will you join the committee of the Friends? So I went in and said, why aren't you showing films of famous British people? We have miles and miles and miles of them. And Roy said, well, hang on, we haven't done photography yet. Actually, he had done one exhibition. He'd done a hugely successful exhibition of Cecil Beaton. And indeed, in Cecil's diary of the parting years, he says that a collection of about 600 of my photographs taken over the last 40 years was shown. It has been an amazing success and seems to have been enjoyed by young and old alike. But anyway, Roy asked me to get interested in the idea of photography before they dealt with film, and in due course, there was an interview with the Post, and I got it. What happened then, about 6 weeks after I arrived in May, I think, in 1972, and on the 5th of July, an exhibition called The Mask of Beauty opened, hugely successful, lots of beautiful ladies from the museum's collection and outside from the gallery's collection. And I said, look, you're going to have to include photography in that as well. And Roy said, okay, you've got 6 weeks. And we did indeed put photographs into it. And I even managed to get Cecil Beaton to lend me a photograph. He actually lent me a negative for us to make the print because we're in such a hurry. And he said, it's the first time I have ever let anyone take one of my negatives away. And I did actually understand why, because when I got it back to the gallery and looked at it with a magnifying glass, there was more touch-up paint and so on than there was actually original photograph. But it went in the exhibition, the print did, and it was great fun to do. And then a couple of 3 years later, nearly, as Gilly has already said, the Hill and Adamson albums came up for sale at Sotheby's. Now, I think I have to be honest and say I'm not even sure I knew who Hill and Adamson were at the time, but Brian Coe, who was the wonderful boss of the Kodak Museum at the time, which of course in those days was still at the Kodak offices in Harrow, rang me up and said, the Royal Academy is selling these amazing albums. They've sent them to Sotheby's. You can't let that happen. And what actually were the reason for it was that the Royal Academy had this Michelangelo Tondo, as we all know, or as many of you know, and they wanted to create a gallery to put it in. And so the estimated price on the Sotheby's that was going to be a Sotheby's was £32,178.50, I think. And that was the cost of the estimate they'd had for building the gallery. Coincidentally, some of you may have read about the fact that when the Royal Academy during the pandemic has been so incredibly hard up, they thought indeed about selling the Tondo. In fact, it didn't happen. somebody made sure that they couldn't do that. But anyway, the albums were presented, and let me read this, to the President and members of the Royal Academy of Fine Arts, London. These attempts to apply artistically the recently discovered process of the calotype are, with great respect, inscribed and presented by their obedient, humble servant, D.O. Hill, Edinburgh, 26th of July, 1846. Those albums were in the Royal Academy unopened. Nobody looked at them or took them off the shelf until 1967, well over 100 years later. And then they tried unsuccessfully to publish them. And in 72, sent them to Sotheby's, 75 rather, sent them to Sotheby's to estimate. And that's when it all happened. Now, as it happened, we had just got, oh, I say we, Roy was instrumental in doing this, Roy Strong, had got photographs added to the export licensing laws, so that a photograph that was more than 70 years old and cost over £100 would be liable to the export licensing regulations. Fortunately, because of that, and because we told them about that, and because we managed to get quite a lot of press coverage, and it's amazing how often to make a museum or an acquisition or anything like that work, you need the support of the press. And I've been very lucky during my career to get that from several notable people and advocates. We persuaded the Royal Academy to withdraw them. They were offered to us with a rather nasty condition. There could not be a public appeal for money. Now, the Portrait Gallery at the time, asked to raise over £30,000, had just £3,000 in its purchase budget. It got more press coverage, and in the end, an anonymous benefactor bought them for the gallery. And you know, half a century later, I've no idea who that anonymous benefactor was. What I do know is that 5 weeks after they got them, we put on the exhibition, squeezed it in a 5-week gap in the gallery's program, and got 23,000 people to see it, which in those days seemed like a very large number. Now I can't change the slides. Here we go again.
Might just need to put your cursor on the slide, Colin, just to make it live, and then you should be able to scroll.
Oh, right, wait a minute. My cursor doesn't want to know. Yes, it does. Oh, yes, there we are.
That's great.
And that was the book that we published of the pictures. And as you see, the photographic masterpieces, 1843 to 47, the contents of those 3 albums. I learned something very interesting then, and I'm sure a lot of the professionals I see are watching now, that this slide I'm showing you is actually of the American edition, because when the British publishers paid for and bought the catalogue to publish it, part of the contract was there'd be an American edition, but the American publishers, Knopf, looked at the English edition and said, the reproductions aren't good enough. We would never be able to sell the book in America with reproductions like that. Very early lesson about the importance of the quality of reproductions. So there goes Hill and Adamson on what comes along another couple of years later, as Gilly has already said. Suddenly, a wonderful album of Julia Margaret Cameron turns up again at Sotheby's. Rather more expensive. Again, somebody I didn't know a lot about at the time, though I had started working on Cameron before they came up. And what we didn't have this time was the notion that we weren't allowed to raise public money. Oh. This book, it had been bought at Sotheby's by the wonderful American collector Sam Wagstaff. And the book, which I thought I had lying here and I could read from, but my memory is good enough, says on the first page, this book is dedicated to Sam Wagstaff, because he agreed that if I could raise the money, he'd let us keep it in England, to Helmut Gernsheim, who for me was the great historian of photography and really reading his books taught me all I knew at the time about photography, and to the 4,000 companies and individuals who contributed to buying it. And that was the first time. I only knew about that later when I read about it in the American magazine Aperture. Was the first time photographs had been bought for a nation by public appeal. First, that again, I've been lucky, I've done a few firsts in my career, but I wasn't aware it was a first. It just seemed like the common sense thing to do at the time. How are we going to buy it? The gallery didn't have the money. We'll ask the public.
Yeah.
And we had two wonderful allies. Amateur photographer ran a lot of articles for us and did a lot of campaigning. And so, even more publicly, did the Sunday Times. Sunday Times magazine, edited by the late lamented Harold Evans, who died last year, was a tremendous supporter of that campaign, and indeed went on being a supporter of mine right through both the National Portrait Gallery and the National Museum of Photography, Film and Television. So again, we put on an exhibition. There is the book. There it is open at the picture of Herschel, and there, because the album belonged to John Herschel, sorry, and there I had just taken the exhibition down, as you can see from all those tacky bits of tape, because we didn't show the original prints like that. We showed the album and turned over a page every day, but we put brilliant copies which Kodak made for us there. And that photograph is taken by the next photographer who was very important in my career, but a living photographer, was the great American photographer, Arnold Newman. And he took that picture. As a result of that and getting to know him, we commissioned him to take a series of photographs of British people. In due course, that became the exhibition and the book called The Great British. And in case you don't recognize them, top left is Sir John Gielgud and Sir Ralph Richardson, the great stage actors of the time. Top right is George Harrison, the Beatles. Bottom left, perhaps the one you're least likely to recognize, was Lord Denning, but he was the master of the rolls, the United Kingdom's most senior judge. And on the right at the bottom, who now become rather more famous at the V&A, Mary Quant. And that gives you an idea of the range of the really distinguished people that we got to agree to sit to Arnold. And he had to travel all over the country. Occasionally, I was lucky enough to be able to go and travel with him. So I can say that I met some rather famous people occasionally because of that. And it was a huge pleasure and a very, I thought, spectacularly good exhibition of this man who specialized in environmental portraits. Later on, I discovered, and only partly when I was looking for what I was going to tell you about in this talk, that there was quite a lot of criticism of my employing a New York photographer to do this. I was working in the National Portrait Gallery of Great Britain, after all, but it seemed to me that it was right and proper for us to seek the greatest, best photographers wherever we could. And that was part of my thinking too about, did it happen about this time? My beginning to campaign for a National Museum of Photography. I can't pretend that I was the first person to think of that. It was suggested back in the 19th century. And then Helmut Gernsheim came along and he suggested it too, but nobody had ever taken the idea up or taken it seriously. And it was now that I began to think about it, I began to talk to people, I began to go and get public coverage for it. And in due course, Dame Margaret Weston, I think she was not a dame by then, the director of the Science Museum, who, bless her, died just a few days ago, January the 12th, she got so interested in the idea that she set up a committee to progress it. And I was the only member of that committee that was not on the Science Museum staff. How was Bradford chosen? Because that's led to quite a lot of controversy over the years, hasn't it? Bradford was chosen simply, originally, by a very simple kind of coincidence. Margaret was president of the Museums Association. Trying to remember the exact date, and I haven't got it. I think it was 1979, but 1980 it was. And she was driven around Bradford, and she saw the building which we went in, and that's how it all began. I'll go on to that story for a bit, because I've got a couple of books that were published just before I went there. The first one is 100 years ago, written with Sir Brian Harrison, as he now is, who became the editor of the Dictionary of National Biography. And the concept for this book was, again, another way of me trying to make photographs more important. The concept was to, instead of having a script, a text, and sending off some young research assistant to find pictures to illustrate it, the research went the other way around. We researched the decade, exactly 100 years ago from when it came out, now rise of the 1870s to 80s. We researched that decade for all the pictures we could find. And then the idea was to find a historian to write the text to go with it. In other words, to reverse the normal process. And that's what we did. And I found Brian Harrison in Oxford. The honest truth is I can't remember how nowadays, but somebody will have recommended him to me. And that's how the book happened. And one review of that book, one I, of course, never forget, says, this book should be in every academic library and historic institution in the world. Well, you can buy it for a couple of quid on eBay now if you want it. The other book that came out just then was my book on portraits. And what can I tell you about this? Because you'd have to look at it and flick through it. Got lots of portraits through the history of photography as part of that series, as you can see on the bottom, called The History of Photography. And that won a wonderful prize. The Musée Français de la Photographie gave it its Grand Prix. And somewhere, I can see it behind me, but if I pick it up, I'll probably drop it. I have a Sèvres vase, which was the prize for that, which was very pleasant. Anyway, back to Margaret Weston. Because it was Margaret Weston who, as I said in this conference, drove round Bradford on the way to a dinner party, I think, and saw an empty theatre. And in fact, in a way, it was two empty theatres, because you can see from that very old sketch, the Prince's Theatre was sitting on top of the People's Palace. We later found out that it had a lot of, it was a very appropriate place to put the museum. First of all, the street that runs down one side was where the first photographic studio in Bradford was set up in the 19th century. But perhaps even more excitingly, given that we were going to put a cinema, or more than one cinema in the end, in this museum, the first screening of the kinematograph, the great Lumiere brothers' way of showing moving pictures outside London, was in that theatre on the 6th of April, 1896. So that's the building which became the National Museum of Photography. Slightly shaming that it says the National Museum of Photography, because it was Margaret Weston's idea, though I've read somewhere not too long ago that it was the City of Bradford Corporation that asked, but no, it was Margaret Weston who said, let's do moving pictures as well. So it was the National Museum of Photography, Film and Television. And the reason it says National Museum of Photography on the top is one of the myriad of mistakes that I made in my career, and I should try not to talk too much about them, of course, is that I thought it was too long a name to put on the top of the museum. And after all, the original concept had been to be, excuse me, had been a museum of photography. Roy Strong, who'd been my supporter and started the whole thing off, wrote, and it was quoted, I think, again in the Sunday Times, but I've forgotten now, I cannot see people travelling up to Bradford, notice the up, I cannot see people travelling up to Bradford to a disused skating rink. Well, yes, it's true that over the top of that, in that tower behind us, there was a skating rink, to see a collection of 250 cameras. He obviously wasn't aware that Bradford was the centre of the second biggest conurbation in Britain, with within 2 hours' journey 6 million people, which is quite enough to keep a museum going. And I wrote elsewhere at about the same time. No, this is the introduction to the first catalogue we ever had. Every one of us is involved in photography, film, and television. We look at photographs in newspapers when we get up in the morning. We see moving pictures on the television before we go to bed. These media are part of everybody's lives. And let's go back to the biggest theatre that we had in it, the biggest cinema, was Britain's only IMAX theatre for a long time. IMAX was 5 stories of the building high, Britain's largest film screen. It was Dame Margaret's idea again. I had never heard of IMAX. There was one in Belgium, and I went to go look at it and saw, oh yes, what a wonderful idea. And what you're looking at here is a photograph of the most famous Yorkshire brass band, the Black Dyke Mills Band, standing on the skeleton structure of the screen before the screen was put up. And this was, I'd done it again. And when people criticized me for the Arnold Newman, nobody seemed to criticize me for the time of commissioning someone called Neil Slavin, a New York photographer who's still a very good friend of mine, who was specialized in group photographs. He published a book called When 10 or More Gathered Together, When 2 or More Are Gathered Together. And that was the book that turned me on to it. And this was one of his earliest pictures. My job was to see what we could get the Black Dyke Mills to do. And they all came and stood on the stage. And I said to one of them, I don't suppose you'd consider climbing up the screen a little bit, would you? Just to give a little bit of shape to the picture. And he looked at the others, and within 5 minutes, they'd all climbed up and produced that wonderful picture, which is one of a number in a book, which was called Britons. Our first exhibition was an exhibition again, here I go again, of a photographer who was not English. I wanted to show for the first exhibition the nearest I could find to a household name. It would have been Cecil Beaton, but he died. And so I went for Karsh of Ottawa, and this famous photograph of Winston Churchill is by Karsh of Ottawa. He famously said that Churchill is looking so grumpy because, as he had a cigar in his mouth, and Karsh reached over and said, "You can't photograph with that in your mouth," and snatched it away. And that's when he got the picture. And of course, as we've already heard from Gilly, one of the great things about my 10 years, well, not just my years, but I mean the whole history of the National Museum, is that a lot of famous photographers appeared there, photographed there, gave master classes there, were interviewed there. Here's another one. This is one of the picture post photographers, Grace Robertson. Grace Robertson, who again died only a few days ago. I got a lovely Christmas card from her, and this was one of her picture post photographers. Grace was married to Thurston Hopkins, another one of the great picture post photographers. And she was one of the people who had a one-man show, one-woman show, should I say. And who were some of the others? If you look at our second guidebook, which is where I quote quite a lot of the things I'm talking to you about, and again, I can't see where I put it, on the back cover, it lists a long list of the photographers appeared there, and Karsh was there, Grace Robertson, Jane Bown, who photographed The Observer for many, many years, and again, who I'd given her first ever exhibition to at the National Portrait Gallery, Frank Herman, Paul Hill, who photographed famously the Vietnam War and things like that, but actually came and photographed one of our galleries in the museum. And perhaps most famously, and most appropriate in many ways, David Hockney. David Hockney was, of course, born and bred in Bradford. He's a Bradford lad. And there he is. I've no idea what the two of us are looking at. Oh, I'm looking at him. But there he is on a visit, one of his first visits to the museum. Somewhere I have the date of that, but I can't remember. But what I can show you is that he took, and some of you have seen them, a series of pictures called joiners. This was one of the things he invented, taking photographs of things, several groups, and then clipping them together. And as it happens, and me you can see on the right, I was one of the first, not because of my importance or because of the Bradford connection, but because I happened to be in Los Angeles when he was making that exploration. And when we put on the show, which I think was the first show of those joiner portraits anywhere, not my decision, but somebody seems to have included the picture of me. And perhaps that was because, well, of the Bradford link, obviously, because actually nearly everyone in it was American and wouldn't have been known to the visitors to the museum in many cases. And now we see him assembling a much bigger joiner. And I'm sorry to say that in these times of lockdown, I wasn't able to get a photograph of the joiner he made of the whole museum, but you can see it in the bottom of that picture. And it is a most spectacular and wonderful picture of the surroundings of the National Museum of Photography, Film and Television in Bradford. And down in the right-hand corner, sorry, you can see another picture of me, this time by another famous photographer, Patrick Lichfield, Lord Lichfield. And the reason that's there is not to show you yet another picture of me, but it's the only picture I've got that shows that in 1988, we won the National Museum of the Year competition. And when you win the Museum of the Year, you get to keep for that year a Henry Moore sculpture, Moonhead, and that's what you can see there in front of us. And there were other people, Tim Page, I think, no, I didn't get a Tim Page. I've been in correspondence with Tim Page trying to get a photograph of him, but he's now in Australia and didn't have a chance of going to his archive. John Partridge, Ken Phillip, Humphrey Spender, Tessa Traeger. There are a huge number of photographers who did visit Bradford. And by the way, I mentioned masterclasses. David Hockney gave his first ever, and possibly only, I don't know, photographic masterclass in the National Museum in Bradford. Now, Gilly said right at the beginning, and I have to move on from Bradford, apart from anything else I can see, having taken so long finding the slides, I shall run out of time, that I became very interested in Hungarian photography. And indeed, here are some Hungarian photographs by Brassoi, Robert Capa, Andrei Kertész, Moholy Nagy, and Munti Munkachi. And how did that happen? Well, we said at the beginning, just give it a second, look at the wonderful Martin Munkachi picture. By the way, by the time Martin Munkachi, he's the one of the 5 famous ones that people seem to have heard off the least. He, when he was a sports photographer, when he was in Budapest, he claimed to be the highest earning photographer in Hungary. When he went to New York, he made the same claim and wasn't able to master the language. He couldn't speak English very well. And that, I think, is, for me, one of the reasons why Hungarians have made their name in photography, because they had real trouble speaking English the same way as we have real trouble speaking Hungarian. And he got this photograph by simply waving his hand and telling her to run like that, because he couldn't explain to her. Anyway, how did it all happen? Well, you've heard so far that I started my career at the National Film Archive with a bit of theatre and California State University and so on in front of it. But actually, my first full-time job after I left university was at Adamson Batchelor Cartoon Films, the makers of Britain's first full-length animated film, Animal Farm. John Hallas and Joy Batchelor, well, actually, Hallas János, the first Hungarian I got involved with. And I don't think things really began there properly, but within almost weeks of my university, I was working for a Hungarian. And then in 1979, I was asked by the Arts Council to write the catalogue for their exhibition of André Kertész at the Serpentine Gallery. Although it wasn't her that asked me to do it, it was the head of art at the Arts Council. I think it's just possible that my wife had something to do with that, because she was the founder of the Serpentine Gallery. She ran it for 13 years, and her parents were Hungarian. So you see, Hungary does play a big part in my life. And Kertész, who for me is the greatest of the Hungarian photographers and perhaps one of the greatest photographers ever, is someone we got to know very well. What happened when I was commissioned to do this, the Arts Council paid peanuts then, as it probably still does, for writing a catalogue or doing anything like that. And I said, all right, don't pay me a fee, pay my expenses to go to New York and interview him. I was cheating slightly, because first of all, Neil Slavin, who I've already mentioned, lived half a mile away from Kertész, so I got free accommodation. And I was then presenting a radio program that some of you may remember called Kaleidoscope. And so the BBC let me take him free of charge into their studio for 2 days to interview him. And that led to that. And in due course, it led to an exhibition in Bradford called the Hungarian Connection. Because talking to Kertész and then researching him when I got back to England, I realized that there were really rather a lot of Hungarian photographers in the world, not just him. I mean, just before the war, Modern Photography published a list of the 100 greatest photographers in the world. 8 of them were Hungarian, which is a pretty large percentage for such a tiny country. And as you've already heard from Gilly, I curated this exhibition of 2011, deeply retired really, well, those are the 5 famous names which have already been quoted at you twice, but we had 40 photographers in the show. It was an amazing show. And I wonder if you can see just behind me, not quite, the poster over my head is for Eyewitness, which says the Times unmissable, time out, 5 stars. It was, though I should stop boasting, this talk is not supposed to be about boasting. It was a spectacularly successful exhibition. I had done one other exhibition after I retired, and that sort of takes us back in a sort of full circle in a way, because I had done a Julia Margaret Cameron exhibition, at the National Portrait Gallery in 2003. I think it's fair to say that in many ways, being retired and not having a major institution to run made one a slightly better curator. So I think that these two shows, this one and Eyewitness, were in many ways the most successful ones I ever did. I certainly hugely enjoyed doing them all. And this was shown here and in the States. And as a result of that, or connected with it, Weston Neff of the Getty Museum suggested that there ought to be a catalogue raisonné of Cameron. It was, as Gilly has already said, the first catalogue raisonné of any photographer ever published. And again, though I had been working on Cameron on and off for nearly 30 years, other people were involved, and the most important co-author was Julian Cox, who had used to work for me in Bradford, used to be a colleague in Bradford, but then went on to the Getty, and so that's how the link really happened. And then in due course, yes, we published the complete photographs, the catalogue raisonné. Something I'm immensely proud of. I didn't agree with the Getty calling it the complete photographs until about 6 weeks before it was printed. It was called the collected photographs, and I said that's what it should stay as, because within 6 weeks of publication we'll find 50 more one. Well, it wasn't, we didn't quite, but we have found 125 since. Going back to that, I think as my last bit of quotation, I cannot resist quoting the best review I've ever had of any exhibition ever. This is, said the Daily Telegraph, Richard Dormant, as perfect an exhibition, as perfect as an exhibition can be. The right size, the right choice of photographs, the right lighting and labels, and a superbly produced catalogue by Colin Ford that tells you everything you need to know about the subject, and not a syllable more. I wish I could say that about what I've been talking to you about over the last 35, 40 minutes or so. I know you've had a few too many syllables. And I also know that the difficulty with doing something like this and being asked to talk about one's career is it sounds as if one's boasting all the time. The fact is, I could never have achieved any of those things without the colleagues, both in Bradford and at the National Portrait Gallery before them. I can see one or two of them are listening to this talk, but I'm not saying it so that you forgive me, folks. It's because I genuinely believe it. And I mean, particularly when you think about the group of curators that we had got together by the end of my decade in Bradford and under my successor, was probably the most knowledgeable group of curators about the history of photography in the world. And I am a very, very, very lucky man to have worked with them and to have had them help me and support me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colin. That was wonderful, and it's fascinating again to hear your career progression. I think I first met you. I'm just going to take your screen off, if I may.
Yes, I was trying to do the same thing.
I think the first time we met was when you were in your office in Bradford, and I came to interview you, which probably was about 1985, 86 or so. And sat down and we interviewed you, and we seem to have kept in contact with a few gaps along the way, but we seem to have kept in contact along the way. And I think one of the things I don't know about you is when was your first sense of looking at a photograph? Were you an amateur? What got you interested in photography and film initially to get you into the BFI?
I think it was actually that walking down it was that conversation with Roy Straw. I took amateur snaps like everybody else, but I didn't think I had a very special relationship with photography before then. And indeed, embarrassingly, I would say I am still not very good at analysing a photograph. There's an instinct in there somewhere, which I look at a photograph and think, oh yes, that works. Or I look at another one and said, oh, how boring. As we now know, terrifyingly, the number of photographs taken every day in the world is over 4 billion a day. I mean, how do we access those? How do we preserve them? How do we find the good ones? But it was a bit easier in my time. And by the way, one thing I haven't said, I said that Curators was the greatest photographer. You can just see over my shoulder a photograph of me and Sue and Curators sitting outside the National Museum. And Curators, the man I've already told you I admire almost above all photographers, had 4 exhibitions on his 70th birthday: Budapest, Paris, New York, and Bradford. Guess which one he came to the opening of? I think you can tell by the way I've introduced it.
It had to be Bradford, of course. Again, I'd like to ask you, before we open up to our audience's questions, about how do you actually go about setting up a National Museum of Photography? From a standing start, from this concept, this idea that you've been propagating through the 70s, how do you actually physically get the museum in place, ready to open? And if you can put that into a few minutes rather than a few hours.
Yeah.
But, I told you it took 17 months. There was one thing which I didn't tell you, is that Margaret Weston, having chosen, fallen a bit for the site, there was a Museums Association dinner at which she sat next to the chief executive of the city, who was Gordon Moore. If I can claim in many ways to be the sort of person who was responsible for campaigning for a long time for the National Museum, and then being lucky enough to run it for a decade, the godparents were definitely Margaret Weston and Gordon Moore. Without them, it would never have happened. And what Margaret is, I wasn't there, but Margaret is said to have told me, she said to Gordon Moore over dinner, was, would you like a National Museum of Photography in that building? I don't know whether she'd included the words film and photography by then, film and television by then. Would you like a National Museum of Photography in that building? If so, what would the city put into it? He basically said, we'll give you the building and we'll give you £2 million. That was what made it happen. What I then had to do, of course, is to find a designer, to deal with contractors, to deal with the whole idea. So we started to put together a team of people who knew about or were interested in the history of photography, both from within the museum and outside the museum. It was a very big collaborative venture. Without all those different talents and pieces of knowledge, it could never have happened. And don't misunderstand me. Despite this apparently rather boastful time talking, I know, as some of you watching know, that I made some quite serious mistakes in my time. You cannot have a career like that and so on without making mistakes. But having people around who spot those mistakes and help you sort them out or correct them is terrific. And the other thing is, because it was new and because there weren't many established curators around, one employed a lot of rather young people. And young people, very now and then, very infuriatingly, would have an idea, or you'd give them something to work on, and they came back with a much better idea than one had thought of oneself, which was very exciting. I mean, one example, and the picture was actually on one of the things which I floated past. I think we were the first museum to have a professional acting company to interpret pictures and the history of photography and so on. It was a student. What happened was at Wakefield College, and I lived at Wakefield, 20 minutes drive away from the museum, had a drama school, a drama department at it, And I went to the head of the college and said, I'd like to have a way of putting theatre into, after all, we're on theatre, 2 theatre sites, we've got 3 auditoria. We'd like to find a theatrical way of interpreting. And as Gilly told you right at the beginning, I'd been in the theatre right back in my career. And indeed, by the end of my career, I came back to it briefly anyway. And he said, oh, yes, a good idea. And I hadn't heard anything for 6 months. Then I went to the head of the drama department and he said, yes, good idea. Nothing happened. And then one day, a student from that department came. And she was so impressive that I employed her when she was still a student. And she built the team, which we called Action Replay, and played for a long time at the museum and went on after my successor's time. And when my successors decided she couldn't afford it anymore, she left and formed a professional entertainment theatre company, which, bless her, I was then the chair of for 13 years. And Michael, I've gone way off the subject. I'm very good at that.
So I'm going to bring you back with another question, actually, Colin. So you've mentioned a few names along the way. You mentioned Roy Strong. You've mentioned some of your colleagues who were curators that you brought into the museum, and Neil Slavin, who I see is in the room this evening. And I just wondered if you could just maybe give a couple of people, or perhaps talk a little bit about 1 or 2 people who have really been influential on you and your career since those early days.
As photographers, well, I was lucky back in my National Portrait Gallery days. One of the things we did for the exhibition, for education, was to get famous photographers to come and give lectures. And that was very interesting. And of course, I hadn't met them before, and they very often gave me very interesting ideas. You remember the great team of Bailey, Duffy and Donovan? Well, they all came and lectured. And what a difference between them. Patrick Litchfield came and lectured. And you get, maybe I better not tell you who said which, but you get, one photographer would say, taking a good portrait is like you look at the subject and you decide on their character, on what sort of person they are, and then that helps you get the photograph right. But another of those famous photographers say, oh, the way to take a portrait is to get the eyes in the top third of the picture. And just learning from how professional photographers worked was extremely exciting. And I've already said, I went off on some of the sittings with, sitting's the wrong word, some of the sessions with Arnold Newman and Neil Slavin and others. And of course you learn from them, and they are very, very influential on you. And I found that very exciting, and I still do. And I think I've been very lucky to get to know them. I have to say, though I didn't know him early enough to go and be with him when he took all those famous photographs, I learned a great deal from Curtis, talking to Curtis, thinking about Curtis. Curtis called his things little happenings. When I told you that I took him to the BBC studios in New York 2 afternoons running, and he insisted, old man that he was, he insisted on walking from his studio, his home in Soho, all the way up to the centre of town to the BBC studios and all the way back. And I'm not exaggerating, every 100 yards or so, he'd say, look at that, look at that, look at that. And he saw photographs in real life all around him all the time. That was influential. That was extraordinary.
I'm going to turn the question around now and ask, what am I going to ask? I'm going to ask, yes, I know you, well, that's what I was going to say. I know you're still working, so I don't want this to sound like it's a sort of the final question in one sense, but if you had to look back on your career so far, then what do you think is the biggest achievement that you would look back with the most satisfaction on?
Oh, I think establishing the museum has to come to the top. The fact that it's rather changed its character nowadays, and I'm not totally sure that I think that was the right thing to do, but that's the subject of another talk. But the fact that this museum was the most What it says, and I can't now see the guidebook I was quoting from, what it says inside the second guidebook to the museum is, this is now the most popular institution devoted to photography in the world. Not my words, but the New York International Herald Tribune. To be able to create a museum in Bradford, and there are still people who say, oh, what's it doing in a place like Bradford? To create a museum there that was the most popular outside London, that beat all but the top 5 London museums, that won the Museum of the Year, that became the most popular institution devoted to the subject in the world. I think I'm entitled to feel a little bit proud of that, aren't I?
I think that's a worthy achievement. And I said, I know you're still working on projects, so I'm sure there's plenty more to come.
Yes, I should just say that, yes, I am. The worst thing that's happened now, of course, is the pandemic. I am theoretically involved in 3 exhibitions, and all of them, of course, have been delayed, postponed, and even cancelled. Perhaps the one I should mention is that at the National Portrait Gallery, where I tried not only to put on famous photographers, but young photographers who'd never had their first show. One of those very early photographers, a man called Paul Joyce. In 1978, I did an exhibition called Elders, which was very successful, went very well, was very happy with. He celebrated his 80th birthday last year, and he's asked me to curate the 80th birthday show. He went on to, we've mentioned Hockney a few times, he did 2 books with Hockney, he made films with Hockney, he made other films, he went on to a hugely successful career. Waiting in the wings is this 80th birthday exhibition we put together, and that again is quite an interesting sort of career, isn't it, to have, for him and for me, and the notion that I gave him his first show and maybe I'm going to give him his last.
Can I say something now? What I was going to say, Colin, was having an exhibition space, a museum in Bradford, for those of us who live in the north of England, was amazing. Oh, can you hear me?
We gave 2 floors of the museum up to the 2 exhibitions.
Yeah.
The rest of the museum was permanent displays, but we had 2 temporary exhibition floors. It didn't always work out like this, but the theory was that one would be a contemporary exhibition and the other would be a historic exhibition. And that was the sort of shape. But every now and then, for various reasons, one lost that. But and those exhibitions, we had some, well, you know, because you went to them, we had some pretty good shows, didn't we?
Yes, oh yes. And I remember at the time I was teaching, and it was very difficult to get photographic books in the north of England, but you could always get them at Bradford, at the museum, which was wonderful.
So you at least would be hugely in favour of having it in Bradford and not moving everything back to London.
Well, everything's very London-centric, I'm afraid, but yes.
I think I'm going to move the conversation on slightly.
Yes, I think so.
I wonder why.
Ever the diplomat here. We have a question from Stephen, who's asking whether there are any plans to do any addition to the Julia Margaret Cameron catalogue resume.
Not as far as I know. I've not had any correspondence with the Getty Museum about it, but it is, I could see that it would be quite interesting to do, even if it would be too expensive to do another whole catalogue raisonné, to do perhaps a small addition to it. And one does do that occasionally. I mean, well, going right back to the Mask of Beauty I talked about, there wasn't time for my photographs to go into the main catalogue, so we did a little book going with it. Another photographer I've worked with for a long time is Clive Barder, the great theatre photographer, who I first got to know when he came to the Alhambra in Bradford, because the museum is smack opposite this wonderful theatre, when Opera North came there and he came to photograph them. And I put on a show of his photographs, and I've done several since, and I've written part of a major book about him. And yet again, when new photographs were done, we did a little sort of appendix to it. So, do you know, Stephen, I've got to be honest, I've never thought about it, but the idea of perhaps doing, as it were, a sort of appendix volume is very interesting, because all the information's there. It may be because what's happened with my Cameron material, research material, is it's going to be in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And somebody who was watching, I don't know if she's still there because I haven't looked at everybody's names up there, excuse me, is sorting that out, because I have to say, having been so boastful for all this time, all my material is terribly messy and untidy and badly filed, but she's dealing with that. And therefore, in a way, a lot of that information would be sitting there and could be put into some kind of appendix now. Maybe it's even a Bodleian project, given that. Again, I've had links with the Bodleian. We've lost the PowerPoint, but there was a picture right at the end there of me with Richard Dovenden, who is the Bodleian librarian, who is very interested in photography himself. And it was my idea when the Birmingham Library collection started to get into trouble. The great Daniel Meadows, a photographer I'm very fond of, great respect for, who ran this photo bus all around Britain for years. His collection finished at the Bodleian because that's what I did. So maybe it's them. I don't know. Stephen, I haven't thought about it before. Thank you.
You've slightly preempted my final question about the archive, because I know that it's quite clear that you must have gathered an enormous amount of important material from some of the great names along throughout your career, and you've already told us now that will be going to the Bodleian, and I can see Janine Freeston in the audience, who I know has been working with you on that. Can you tell us a little bit about the plans, when that might happen, and when it might become accessible?
Well, you've already given away the name of the person who's working on it, and I know that she's getting on with it, and she even told me that she had a big thrust coming this weekend. But I don't know the date, but I can't think it's very far away. And I think, despite my ability to be so disorganized, I think there's a great argument for them getting on with it, because it might be helpful to do it while I'm still alive and might remember something.
Well, I think on that note, I think you're going to be with us for very many years to come yet, Colin, and I hope you are, because I know that there's so much that you're wanting to do and projects that you've already indicated. So thank you for sharing a little bit of your career, because there's a whole raft of things that you haven't told us about. Your involvement with the Julia Margaret Cameron Trust at Bimbola, for example, the Krauss Book Awards, all these other activities that you've been involved in over the years. So I think that may be the opportunity to bring you back for a second time and talk about some of those other things. So I'd like to thank you for sharing your career with us this evening so far, and for Gilly, who's the chair of the RPS Historical Group, for introducing you and for highlighting some of the pointers that you explored a bit through your own presentation. And thank you for setting up a National Museum of Photography that is still going strongly. And I know Joe and Jeff and other people that you worked with from the museum are in the audience tonight, and I'm sure that they would echo that. And thank you, Colin, for everything that you've done for photography since, the 60s or so.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Pleasure.
Thank you from me as well. Thank you very much for agreeing to take part.
And thank you to our audience for
Yes, thank you to everybody for actually bearing with us. Most of them seem to have stayed with us all the time. I'm impressed.
Thank you, everyone. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.